Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first in our series of project seminars under the Rule of Law and Legal Culture project. I'm Karen Lee, the moderator of today's series. I'm of the Department of Social Sciences of the Education University of Hong Kong. We have three speakers today. To my left is Mr. Alan Leung, SC, Mr. Benny Tai, and Dr. Simon of Hong Kong U Space. Benny will give you a more detailed introduction of our project, but I'd like to also share with you the background of today's series. Today's series is the first in our series under our project, which is a project that seeks to identify and compare the values and beliefs of the general public's perceptions of rule of law, as well as the insiders of the legal systems and their perceptions towards the legal systems and rule of law in Hong Kong. We hope that by doing this project, we can find whether there are certain cultural values that are required to sustain the rule of law in Hong Kong. Today, we'd like to share with you our findings over some questions we have asked to the public and the insiders of the legal system. Mr. Benny Tai will first share with you the project and the details, and he'll give you about a presentation of 30 minutes, and followed by a presentation of Mr. Leung. After the break, Dr. Simon will discuss the issues that have arisen during their presentations. Now, I'd like to welcome Mr. Benny Tai.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Actually, our research team includes Dr. Karen Lee, myself, and Mr. Simon. The title of our series is Rule of Law and Legal Culture. So we actually put forward a hypothesis that there's a relationship between the rule of law and the legal culture of the community. But then the title for this session is about democratic values. So what is the relationship between democratic values and the rule of law? That might be a series of questions we have to answer before we can see the relationships. Now, firstly, what actually is the relationship between democratic values and the rule of law? To some people or to some scholars in this field, in the study of the rule of law and in the study of democracy, that they may consider the two things to be wide apart, and that might not be a clear connection between the two. So before we look into the empirical findings we have, I think we have to provide at least some theoretical basis that how the two could be connected. But in order to build up that connection, there are more questions we have to answer. What is the rule of law? And what is democracy? And what is the relationship between the rule of law and democracy? So before we talk about democratic values, just to look at the two concepts, rule of law and democracy, can we see the relationship? But even if we could establish the relationship, we must also further look into the relationship between what we call the institution and culture. So these are some, you may say, the theoretical basis of our study. By exploring these questions, then we can, if we can provide a satisfactory answer to these questions, then we can approach the, look at the empirical findings that we have and try to see whether Hong Kong people embrace democratic values and how that would affect the development of the rule of law in Hong Kong. So I'll start with a definition that has been, I think, widely accepted by rule of law scholars and advocated by Professor Brian Tamanaha. He is a well-known rule of law scholar, and he also claimed himself to be so-called the thin theorist. For those who are familiar with the theories of the rule of law, you may know that they are so-called the thick theorists and the thin theorists. The thin theorist sees the rule of law as, defined here, government officials and citizens are both bound by and abide by the law. Thin theorists try to separate the idea of the rule of law from any other values or any other principles of constitutionalism, like democracy, human rights protection, because they want to provide, you may say, a thin or a pure understanding of the rule of law. The rule of law means just compliance with the law by officials and the citizen. But if you read the work of Professor Tamanaha, actually in the work that I've cited here, that he actually mentioned in the article, in the paper himself, that to achieve this goal of government officials and citizens to be bound and abide by the law, there must be systems to check the powers of the government and to ensure officials are bound by law. But he like most rule of law scholars, that the focus is on the judiciary, seeing the judiciary as the most important mechanism to ensure compliance of law by officials. So that's, if we use the definition of Tamanaha, now might be that there seems to be no direct relationship between the rule of law and democracy. Then, what is democracy? So I think Robert Dell's work has been referred by many to be the understanding of democracy. So I just referred to his book on democracy, that he provided 5 standards of democratic process, like effective participation, voting equality, enlightened understanding, control of the agenda, inclusion of adults. So I don't think I need to elaborate a lot of his ideas about democracy. So if you read this understanding of democracy, then again, we may not see any clear connection between the rule of law and democracy. So are we talking about things that are difficult or may not be possible to connect it with each other? Fortunately, I have the assistance of a very famous political scientist, Francis Fukuyama. And in his latest book, Political Order and Political Decay, it's actually a huge work. It takes a lot of time to digest the whole book. But I've taken out one very important quotation, and he may have provided the basis for connecting the rule of law and democracy. So he concludes that after, actually the 2 books that he has, the first book is more on historical inquiry about the origin of the rule of law, and then this second book talk about the development of democracy. But he concluded in his work that rule of law and democratic accountability are, after all, alternative means of constraining power, and in practice are often mutually supportive. So after his very detailed study about the origin and the development of the rule of law and democracy, he concluded that the two actually are connected. As I think even Tamanaha would recognize that a very important aspect of the rule of law is to constrain powers. And this also from a political scientist, Francis Fukuyama, that democracy or democratic accountability is also, and also maybe see as one of the major functions, is to constrain governmental powers. So we can see the possible connection between the rule of law and democracy. I may refer to another work which may be able to spell out the relationship between the rule of law and democracy in greater details. This is by O'Donnell. In his work, he put forward this concept called democratic rule of law. I find it very inspiring about this idea of democratic rule of law. So having rule of law is not the end. Actually, maybe we have to go further. We may have to have a kind of rule of law called democratic rule of law. So in his work, he put forward the 3 conditions of democratic rule of law. The first one, it upholds the political rights, including surely the right to elect officials to represent the people to govern. And also it upholds the civil rights of the whole population. So in order for the democratic or the political rights to be enjoyed by the citizens, now there must be a wide range of civil rights, like freedom of expression, freedom of movement, and the others must also be protected. And then the third condition is that it establishes networks of responsibility and accountability, which entails that all public and private agents, including the highest officials, so in our Hong Kong context, it must also include the chief executive, are subject to appropriate legally established controls on the lawfulness of their acts. So I think this idea of democratic rule of law and may provide us a clear foundation to see the rule of law and democracy together. Summarizing it, I would say that democracy and the rule of law has this mutual or this dual relationship, that democracy, to a certain extent, is a means to achieve the goal of the rule of law, that is to constrain the powers of the government. But the rule of law is also, in a way, is a means to achieve the end of democracy, that is to protect the fundamental political rights and civil rights of the people. So it is a kind of dual relationship between the rule of law and democracy. I hope that through this arguments that we can establish that that is a clear relationship between the rule of law and democracy. So when we are talking about the rule of law, actually we cannot overlook the importance of protecting or ensuring democracy. But at the same time, when we are talking about democracy, we must also include the ideas and the principles of the rule of law. Now, if I can solve the problem of the rule of law and democracy, then what is the relationship between the institutions and culture? Now, all the things just mentioned, they might be what we call institutions. We have laws made, structures established, people operating or using certain process to operate a system. But what's the relationship between the institutions and values or cultures? So I may refer to some definitions by scholars in the field of legal culture. So legal culture refers to ideas, values, expectations, and attitudes towards law and legal institutions. So these are what we call legal culture. They are about the ideas, values, expectations, and attitudes towards the legal institutions. And according to one of the guru in this area, Lawrence Friedman, Professor Lawrence Friedman, he kind of see the legal culture as two kinds of legal culture, as we base on his work to develop our own research, that we look into not just the legal culture of the general population, and Professor Friedman called that the external legal culture. And we also look into the legal culture, that is the attitudes towards law and the legal mechanisms of the legal actors like judges, lawyers, legislators, government officials. So we call that the internal legal culture. Now the relationship between the legal culture and the rule of law, or the relation between the legal culture and law, can be spelled out by this quotation. Law is not just the sum of courts, legislators, police, prosecutors, or other formal institutions. Law is also a normative system that resides in the minds of the citizens of the society. So I think that can bring out the relationship between law and culture and the legal culture. But how about the rule of law? So again, I refer to another work by several scholars, that the rule of law is as much a culture, as the scholars claim, as a set of institutions, as much a matter of habits, commitments, and beliefs of ordinary people. And we need that kind of legal or the rule of law culture, we may call that, to back them up. And I refer again to Brian Tamanaha, that in his work, he talked about mainly the institutions of the rule of law. But at the end of his paper, he also referred to the so-called the rule of law culture. The rule of law culture is a kind of shared cultural beliefs concerning the legal systems that to uphold the rule of law. And his conclusion is that when this cultural belief is pervasive, the rule of law can be resilient, spanning generations and surviving episodes in which the rule of law had been thwarted by government officials. That sounds very important to the case of Hong Kong. And when this cultural belief is not pervasive, the rule of law will be weak or non-existent. So Brian Tamanaha, mainly a theme theorist or institutionalist of the rule of law, but in his study about the rule of law, he actually also accepted the importance of culture. So we call it the legal culturist approach of looking at the matter. Now, these are legal scholars. Then can we have a more general understanding about institution and culture? So I would like to refer to, and again, a very big book and thick work by Martha Nussbaum. And again, her work is about political emotions. I see the understanding of political emotions very similar to the idea of culture we are talking about, or the political culture we are talking about. So she spelled out three relationships between the rule of law, the culture and institutions. I just maybe reading the text is a bit difficult to follow. Maybe I'll just use the diagram to illustrate. The relationship between three relationships between institution and culture, that for institutions, no matter generally talking about political institutions, or maybe we can talk about any kind of institutions, you need a certain kind of culture to sustain it. But by establishing a certain kind of culture, institution, it may play the role to shape the culture of the community. But when the people demand for certain things as reflected in their culture, they may work to transform the existing institutions to conform with what they believe to be right. So that's the three relationships between institution and culture, sustaining, shaping, and transforming relationships. So that's the basis, the theoretical basis of our study, that I think we could claim that if the Hong Kong society has the rule of law culture, which may include also the democratic values, as we see the rule of law as not merely compliance with law, but also the democratic accountability, then the question we ask today will be relevant, because we will have to look at whether Hong Kong people embrace the democratic values that will be needed for sustaining the democratic rule of law. And if Hong Kong people have this kind of orientation, then would the attitudes of Hong Kong people work to transform the existing institution? Surely our existing system is not really democratic. So, but at least we have certain part of our system democratic. Then would the existing systems also shape the attitudes of the Hong Kong people? So that's some of the questions. We could not be able to answer all these questions in our study, but some of the questions may be able to provide some insights. So just to explain the study we have conducted, that the internal legal culture, as I've mentioned, we have sent out a questionnaire with around 70 questions to we call it internal assessors. So we have judges, LegCo members, administrative officers, the senior government officials, and officers of disciplinary forces, and lawyers. They are randomly selected from their groups. And depending on their response rate, so if we can get the reply from those people we send the invitation, then we'll stop if it satisfied our required number. If not, we'll continue to random select more people from that particular group. So we try to have different groups of people from the operation, different aspects of operation of legal system. So we have 35 people responding to represent, we call it the internal legal culture. And the external legal culture, we have a very big sample size, 3,500 randomly selected Hong Kong citizens. Actually, we asked them the same set of questions. So you can see that the comparison between the two, the internal and the external legal culture. Now, we have a kind of very rough assessment of the responses. Now, depending on the answer, that if it agree with the statement we give them, that may be a favorable answer, but in other contexts, disagree or strongly disagree would be a favorable answer. So we look at just the percentage of favorable assessment that to see whether the rule of law culture is established or well established, strong, very strong, or entrenched. And if it's less than 50% of the respondents saying that providing us with the favorable assessment, that it will be unestablished, weak, or very weak. So that's a kind of very rough estimation of the rule of law situation. So we have a list of questions. I think we'll talk more than the questions we have provided to Alan and Alan. So maybe you can also comment on some of the findings here. Now, the first question we ask is that political leaders are chosen on the basis of their virtue and capability, even without election. So I think from here, you can see that the disagree or strongly disagree would be favorable assessment. So those who respond these questions by saying that they disagree or strongly disagree, we'll take them as strong, as a favorable assessment. That is favorable to the rule of law culture. And look at it that you will find that the external legal culture actually is established, but it is only just above 50%. But for the internal legal culture, it's 68.8, so it's called it well established. But it's not yet reached the stage of the level of strong or very strong. And look at the second question. Now, this is more related to the case of Hong Kong about the functional constituencies. Interest groups having significant contribution to the society must have representatives in the legislature. Now, from the rule of law perspective or the democratic values perspective, again, disagree or strongly disagree would be considered as a favorable. But you'll find that here, the external legal culture is actually weak, that only 24.3% of the people disagree or strongly disagree. And even the internal legal culture we have just established is only more than just about 50%. About this statement, this is a more general statement. Election should be equal, open, and fair. And if you look at the results, now this statement, agree and strongly agree, would be considered as favorable. Now we can see this from both external and internal is entrenched. It's more than 90%. So we agree with this general statement. But when we look at this statement, that is the representation of interest groups in the Legislative Council, we seem to find a contradictory result. So some explanations might have to be given. And maybe we may hear some of the comments by Alan. And so another question we ask, the most important thing in society is having a great leader instead of a good system. So clearly, disagree and strongly disagree will be considered as favorable. Now, you can see the discrepancies between the external and the internal legal culture. The external legal culture is unestablished. The less than 50% of the general public will disagree with this statement. But you look at the internal legal culture, it is very strong. It's close to a very high level of support against this statement. And that's also some finding we find is that that's a discrepancy between the general population and the internal and those who are responsible operating the system. This statement, government officials are like parents. It is proper for them to decide what is good for us. Now, again, disagree would be favorable responses. Now, this one, the external legal culture, is well established, but not as strong as the internal legal culture. It's very strong. Okay? And actually, this similar statement has been asked in the value survey. And this question has been asked in studies in China also. I may also later tell you about the results. Surely not as good as the case of Hong Kong. And this statement, every citizen enjoy equal right to elect the chief executive. Now this, again, the agree and strongly agree would be considered as favorable assessment. And in both statements, we find that the external and internal, they are strong. But this one is interesting, that we find that the external is stronger than the internal. 78 higher than 72 in the case of internal. Might be the reasons that those who are operating the system, they have the direct contact with the chief executive. They may worry about if the person is elected by equal rights, would that affect their work directly or not? But I don't think there's a few percentage differences. We can draw such conclusions, such kind of conclusions, but maybe just some kind of speculations. So basically, we have covered some of the important questions and some of the findings. And that's also why we organized this series of seminars, because reading these empirical findings is not easy. We can see some general patterns there, but to try to find explanations will be much more difficult. Therefore, we invite speakers, experts to join the panel to give us their ideas, and also all of you coming to the seminars, we also would like to hear how to interpret the results. And all the things you said, I hope that you will not mind, will be recorded, because that will be included in our final report as you assist us to complete the whole research, because we need to find explanations. Though we could surely provide some of our ideas, but the more we like is to hear your views about how you interpret the different findings, especially when we see some kind of results that might be quite different from our original perception, and also the discrepancies between the external and the internal legal culture, if you agree with the ideas of internal and external legal cultures. Okay, thank you.
Now, our next speaker is Mr. Alan Leung. I know that Mr. Alan Leung knows no introduction, but as a moderator, I need to give a few words about Mr. Alan Leung. Mr. Alan Leung is the former chairperson of the Hong Kong Bar Association, the former leader of the Civic Party, and I understand that his term has just ended on the 30th of September 2016. And Mr. Leung is also a three-term legislator between 2004 and 2016. So with such a credential, I believe that Mr. Leung can share with you all about democracy and the rule of law. So let's welcome Mr. Leung.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is really a great honor to be invited to address the audience present today. Wow, so sensitive. And as I understand it, this is the first seminar in this series that Annie just introduced to all of you. There are, I think, 7 more to come, and I hope with the speakers and your participation and contribution, this project will end up instructing Hong Kong more on the relationship between democracy and the rule of law. I think I am uniquely placed in a way to make contribution to this project, because I think I can speak from both the internal and external cultures. As a legislator, of course, I as defined, I'm part of the internal culture, but I'm also mandated to represent at least my constituency, Kowloonese, and I know from my day-to-day contact with the Kai Fongs how they would look at Hong Kong today, what has contributed to ending us up here, and what they want Hong Kong to develop into. But for me, I've never doubted the so-called relationship or nexus between democracy and the rule of law. In fact, it was my answer to this question that brought me into politics. In the year 2001 to 2003, I was chairman of the Hong Kong Bar, and fate has it that during my reign as the bar chair, Tung Chee Hwa and the now Honorable Regina Yip were pushing the Article 23 legislation, National Security Bill. And the bill, if passed as then promoted by the Hong Kong SAR government, would impact on the rule of law so adversely that we would not be able to keep the institution which has been protecting us for years, decades. You may remember that Regina Yip told the public of Hong Kong that the Hong Kong SAR government would only pass the laws as required by Article 23 of the Basic Law, but the laws will just be sitting there, and she doesn't mean to enforce them. Or she floated the idea that, well, the proposed Article 23 legislation may appear to you to be very strict, very stringent, but, well, take it easy. When it comes to enforcement, the government will do it with all the leniency in the world. Now, these statements, obviously, to anybody who knows about what the rule of law as an institution is and should be, would throw up his hands and cry out in dismay. Now, but you see, when I requested an audience with the then Secretary for Security, I was consistently denied that audience. I tried to approach the then Secretary for Justice, Ms. Elsie Lam, and you know what answer I got from Elsie? Alan, I do not have the carriage of this bill. Regina is calling the shots. Well, of course, then my natural response would be, well, then set up a meeting between the chairman of the bar and the Secretary for Security. And Elsie came back, at least on 2 or 3 occasions, upon my pressing. Oh, Regina said she was too busy to meet you. The arrogance exhibited by the Secretary for Security speaks loads about the importance of democracy. If she has to answer to the public at large in Hong Kong, would you have expected that kind of arrogance from an office bearer in the executive branch of government? Of course not. And after some very serious and indeed painful reflections, I decided to run for public office because I wanted to have implemented and established in Hong Kong a political system that would make all those vested with public powers to have first gone through the baptism of fire, as I then described it. With a pen, a notepad, and a stool. Where are these? Now, why have they disappeared? Why is he doing so much harm to the rule of law in Hong Kong in the past 4 years of his reign? It's because he doesn't have to answer to the people. He only has to answer to Zhongnanhai, to leaders in Beijing. He looks up instead of looks down. I hope I've amply demonstrated the importance of democracy, democratic values, in upholding the rule of law as an institution that we love and hold dear to our hearts. I don't think it needs further elaboration. Because of the constraint of time, unlike Benny, who is, I think, very used to lecturing in this university and to cater for the tastes of students these days, I'm not very good at PowerPoints. In fact, I take the view, a very conservative one, that PowerPoints may actually be source of distractions. Anyway, fortunately, I do not have to lecture very often in the university and to satisfy the wishes of the students. But what I have done, ladies and gentlemen, is that I've put together, with the assistance of a very able junior, Mr. Son Lee, in my chambers, a speaking notes, a set of speaking notes, to which I would refer briefly from time to time during the next 20 minutes or so. But you're welcome to take them away, and I certainly think, as I was talking to Benny before we started, that in fact the CCPL should consider making these materials more freely, readily available to the general public of Hong Kong. Legal education is very important. You can't simply have those within the system, or what you describe as part of the internal culture, to stand up for the rule of law when the institution is under challenge. You really need the man in the street, the man on the one-child tram, to be able to know the importance of the institution and to stand up for it when it is being challenged by people, including from Beijing and the chief executive. I certainly think this project is a very timely one because you highlight for Hong Kong, for Hong Kongers, the importance of a democratic form of government that is truly accountable to the people, and how it is a must to have the institutions sustained before we can continue to enjoy the freedoms and the rule of law as an institution that have protected us for decades. I was given 3 questions in particular to comment on, as I have set out in my speaking notes. The first question is set out on page 2, underscored and bold-typed. To what extent do you agree with this statement? The most important thing in society is having a great leader instead of a good system. Now, I say in my notes that this inquiry, posing the concept of a great leader and good system as dichotomous and mutually exclusive choices, is essentially masquerading a higher question about Hong Kong public's preference towards a system of rule of law versus rule by man versus rule of law. Looking at the statistics, it is not surprising at all that most actors within the system scoring as high as 84.9% of the sample would disagree with such a statement. If you would kindly look at paragraph 4, where I quoted from the Right Honourable Lord Neuberger of Abbotsbury, a non-permanent judge of the CFA and President of the UK Supreme Court. And the learned judge said, the rule of law is fundamental to any civilized society. And the rule of law means, at the very least, that a society is governed by laws which are properly enacted, clearly expressed, publicly accessible, generally observed, and genuinely enforceable. Enforceability includes access to the courts for people to enforce rights and to defend themselves. Rights which are unenforceable are as bad as no rights at all. The rule of law also requires the honest, fair, efficient, and open dispensation of justice. And Lord Neuberger, in the same speech, explained, democracy is not faultless, and it can lead to the tyranny of majority. And in extreme cases, it can lead to tyrants, or worse, both Hitler and Mussolini came to power democratically. Politicians are frequently driven to take decisions based on expediency. That is not intended to be a criticism, it is the nature of the role. The courts can therefore usefully act as a brake on political calculation and short-termism. Furthermore, the very fact that judges do not have to worry about being re-elected or losing their jobs means that they can and should sometimes make the difficult, unpopular decisions which are understandably very difficult for politicians. But this is a power which judges should exercise diffidently and cautiously. Now, I think what has fallen from our Chief Justice, Geoffrey Ma, when he spoke on the subject strength and fragility in tandem, the rule of law in Hong Kong, at the Bar Council of England and Wales annual International Rule of Law lecture in 2015, is most relevant to note in this context. The Honourable Chief Justice Ma quoted from Lord Bingham But belief in the rule of law does not import unqualified admiration of the law, or the legal profession, or the courts, or the judges. We can hang on to most of our prejudices. It does, however, and this is important, call on us to accept that we would very much rather live in a country which complies, or at least seeks to comply, with the principle I have stated, than in one which does not. The hallmarks of a regime which flouts the rule of law are, alas, all too familiar. The midnight knock on the door, the sudden disappearance, the show trial, the subjection of prisoners to genetic experiment, the confession extracted by torture, the gulag and the concentration camp, the gas chamber, the practice of genocide or ethnic cleansing, the waging of aggressive war. The list is endless. Better to put up with some choleric judges and greedy lawyers. This is from the Chief Justice, quoting Lord Bingham. I ask, do the public feel the same way about the importance of a good system? Now, as instructed by question 1, and the answers that question 1 has attracted from the external legal culture, you will see that only 48.7% of people from the external legal culture answered with a disagree, strongly disagree, and don't know. So this is not very encouraging. But you see, I say that under paragraph 8 of my speaking notes, that although more members of the public disagree that a great leader is more important than a good system, than those who agree, this figure does deviate substantially from the responses from actors from within the system. Nonetheless, there may be some truth in the public's yearning for a great leader. While great leadership and good systems are clearly not mutually exclusive, unlike how the survey has put it, given the current political atmosphere, one may find good reason why great leaders are sought after, perhaps even more so than a good system. The Occupy protests and the subsequent Mongkok riots were probably resultant from bad leadership, and even worse, governance. And judges in adjudicating these cases were often put in the wrong light by the public, with the latter thinking that judges must have and will take their own political views in these issues. Chief Justice Ma said on one occasion, "Pressure groups and other, including legislators, have continually been complaining publicly about the acquittal of persons prosecuted in the Occupy protests. The concerns over the rule of law are that the courts, by acquitting the persons charged, have been acting inconsistently with public opinion and against the public interest." In the same speech, the learned judge continued, "And yet, if one is analyzing cases determined by the courts, the more pertinent question must, of course, surely be whether the court has applied the law and acted in accordance with law, as opposed to applying extraneous factors, meaning non-legal matters such as political considerations. Put shortly, the existence or non-existence of the rule of law cannot be gauged by the outcome of a case alone. After all, and this is particularly so in public law cases, the individual parties or a portion of the public, even the majority, may wish for a particular result, but whether or not the result is achieved is entirely dependent on the legal merits, and the result alone provides no clue as to whether the court has acted independently or in accordance with its constitutional mandate of applying the law and its spirit, and nothing else. It is perhaps convenient at this point to make reference also to the judicial oath in Hong Kong, which requires a judge to uphold the law, act in full accordance with the law, and safeguard the law and administer justice without fear or favor, self-interest or deceit. Now, I leave you to read paragraph 12, because of shortage of time. Similar observations were made by the learned Chief Justice in the first ceremonial opening of the legal year after the conclusion of the Occupy protests. If I may pick up from paragraph 13, the way I see it is that great leadership and good systems cannot possibly be seen as mutually exclusive options. While it is fundamental that a good system of rule of law in Hong Kong should be protected as the ultimate end, this is not to say that great leadership is not needed. In fact, bad leadership often leads to the erosion of an otherwise good system, and in many cases, bad executive governance might even place the judges in difficult positions to take decisions, basing rightly so completely on legal merits with wide-ranging social, political, and economic outcome that otherwise would easily be solved by the executive and legislative branches should they be functioning properly. Some issues may be easier to be solved on the executive end. It is for this reason why it is alarming that a not so insignificant portion of the public preferred a great leader over a good system in the specific context of the Hong Kong political climate. This may actually not be a huge surprise, given that the Hong Kong people have taken the rule of law for granted for many years. Yet the most fundamental issues that have been plaguing Hong Kong have not yet been solved, primarily due to the lack of good leadership. So that is my take of the answers or responses attracted by the first question that I'm asked to comment on. I think it is really important for us to bear in mind that not many in Hong Kong are aware of how the rule of law as an institution has been protecting them. Just like you are born to expect that you have air to breathe, and I tell you that, it is very difficult to maintain the supply of air for you to breathe, and in the past 12 years I've been trying my utmost, working my hardest to try to make sure that you will continue to have air to breathe tomorrow morning when you wake up. I think a good number in Hong Kong would think that I'm crazy. But ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you, this is exactly what I've been doing in the past 12 years. Exactly. In every sense of that phrase. I'm working the hardest and doing my utmost to try to make sure that you will still have air to breathe when you wake up tomorrow morning on Sunday. I know it is not very sexy a thing to tell the public that this is exactly what you should give me credit for. But credit or otherwise, this is what the Democratic camp, especially lawyers in the Democratic camp, have been doing in the past. If I may pause here to observe that I find this project particularly timely because the rule of law is probably now the last bastion of Hong Kong, of the Hong Kong we used to know. Every other institution has fallen. The executive branch of the government is now controlled by an underground communist. The legislature has turned red. Look at who is running for the president. a functional constituency member returned with 0 vote. You know what if I may just digress a little bit. I spoke with the Honorable Andrew Lam a few days ago when he tried to lobby for my support of his presidency. I told Andrew, look here, Andrew, you may now be given the blessing by Beijing. You enjoy authority and powers that, to me, are not justified. They came to you unfairly. But please do not forget that one day, well, this is still my belief, that one day, universally accepted values will prevail over Hong Kong. What you are doing now is against the wishes of at least half of Hong Kong. What if that half of Hong Kong that you are now offending will stand up one day and Hong Kong once again practices universally accepted values? How you would end up when that scenario is obtained will depend on how you behave as president in the next 4 years. We are both victims of this unfair system. Don't overplay it. It will come back to you. You may not necessarily have the last laugh. Well, I suppose that is the most I can say in the given circumstances. Let me not digress for too much. Question 2 that I was asked to comment on goes like this. Page 5, well, according to my printout. I don't know about yours. Is it page 5? Yes. To what extent do you agree with this statement? Government officials are like parents. It is proper for them to decide what is good for us. Now, I originally thought, given the responses to the first question, that people will say, yeah, of course. Well, because we are looking for a good leader instead of a good system, so I would listen to this good leader. So I originally, before I cast my eyes on the responses, the analysis, the percentages, I thought, well, probably it would have attracted the same sort of responses as the first question did. But to my delightful surprise, the responses came out a little bit differently. Now, I say under paragraph 15, similar to the responses given to the first question, again, most actors from within the system disagreed that it is better for government officials to decide what is good for the public. This is consistent. Right? Indeed, it is at the core of the common law system and its belief that decisions by public authorities are not perfect. They could be illegal, irrational, or a disproportionate response. Well, these are the usual grounds for judicial review, right? For this reason, judges have often advocated the importance of judicial review in Hong Kong, and that measures taken against the government could perhaps be the secret to good governance. In the ceremonial opening of the legal year 2016, the Chief Justice, Honorable Ma, said the following: to save some time, I only read to you the 3 lines underscored. A decision of the court is in public law litigation will often serve as a guide to good governance, whether looking at events in the past or perhaps more importantly, the future. And in this quote, Honorable Chief Justice Ma actually said, although there may occasionally be inconveniences, judicial review overall serves the public interest and facilitates the well-being of our society. This status should properly be recognized. Former Chief Justice Andrew Lee said in a speech when addressing the conference titled Conference on Effective Judicial Review, a Cornerstone of Good Governance, said the following, if I may quote, "It is of course a cardinal feature of a society governed by the rule of law that the citizen is protected through judicial review against any abuse of public power. It is fundamental to good governance that public powers should be exercised within legal limits and with fairness. This is essential for commanding the confidence and respect of the community in the process of government. In short, as is so aptly captured by the title to the conference, judicial review is a cornerstone of good governance. It enhances the quality of governance by ensuring its legality and fairness." Now, looking at the statistics showing the public's overall preferences towards a paternalistic government, the figures show a departure from how the sample answered the first question. 69.4% of the sample disagreed that it is proper for government officials to decide what is good for the people. I would say that this result is unsurprising. As commented by the former Chief Justice Lee, I quote, "In Hong Kong, as elsewhere, the phenomenon of the striking growth in judicial review cases has resulted mainly from 3 factors. First, modern life has become increasingly complex. Inevitably, many areas of activities have to be subjected to state regulation in the public interest. This has led to a very substantial growth in the volume of legislation, with an increasing range of discretions vested in public officials. Secondly, new constitutional instruments have been enacted. Executive and legislative acts may be challenged on the ground of inconsistency with the constitutional provisions, including the guarantees of fundamental rights and individual freedoms. In the Hong Kong context, the Basic Law and the Bill of Rights have enabled such challenges to be made. Thirdly, with better education, citizens have higher expectations of public institutions and are more conscious of their rights and freedoms. With improved access to legal representation, including that through legal aid, they are more prepared to invoke the law in seeking to protect their rights and freedoms." Now, in viewing the 2 questions on the survey together, one could come to the inevitable conclusion that while the public does yearn for better executive governance, that is, calling for a great leader, this should not be done at the expense of a good system, such as the rule of law. This can be clearly indicated by the staggering growth of the number of judicial and constitutional reviews lodged against the government in recent years. This indicates 2 things, I argue. Firstly, the public has made increasing number of calls for better governance from within the system itself via an established good system, that is the legal system, and the rule of law. And secondly, at the same time, indicates and proves the point that the public generally does not prefer a system of paternalistic government and believes that it is good that a system is in place to check our government and its work. Now, I said that this came as a delight because, at the very least, the general public of Hong Kong is wise enough to understand that power corrupts and absolute power absolutely corrupts. And if you are given power, unless you know that you are watched by the people, by the courts and judicial reviews, you can easily go very wrong. This is, I would propose, is human nature. Now, I'm able to sit here and say things like this because I have no power. Now, if I were the chief executive and I had the powers that C.Y. Leung now has, I may not be able to say the same thing. This is human nature. And that is why it is so important for the rule of law as an institution to be maintained, sustained, and to flourish. Well, to strip it to the bones, we need the rule of law because we don't trust human beings. And if you study history, you can easily find ample examples of that. Anyway, time is running out. Question 3. To me, this is more political than legal. I was asked to comment on the responses attracted by the question, to what extent do you agree with this statement? Interest groups having significant contribution to the society must have representatives in the legislature. I don't know how many of those responded were aware of the fact that the agriculture and fishery sector is given 60 seats, 60 seats in the election committee, whereas lawyers who are making so important contributions to Hong Kong are only allotted 30 seats. Now, so if the logic of this question is carried, that must mean that the fishermen and those who farm our lands are making doubly important contributions to Hong Kong than lawyers. Come on. At least give us 60 seats. I would say that we have made at least as important contributions as the fishermen and those who farm our land. Anyway, I say under Para 22 that a question masqueraded to discuss the population's preference towards functional constituencies. This question has more to do with one's political views rather than one's faith in the system of the rule of law in Hong Kong. I'm not saying that it has nothing to do with it, but it has more to do with politics than the rule of law as an institution. But of course, if you visit it at the level of fairness, equality to all, then of course it has its rule of law perspective and angle. This is also the question where most interviewees responded with unknown or don't know as their answers. Well, that is, of course, amongst the 3 questions that I was given. With 56.3% of those within the system disagreeing to the statement, but only 24.3% of those outside the system disagreeing to the statement, this question perhaps raised the greatest difference in perception between the 2 sectors. For those who are within the system, who work with laws on a daily basis, their disagreements may be attributable to an overall commitment towards equality before the law. This means more than just seeking equality before the law when a dispute arises, but more generally in the making of the laws themselves. As most laws in Hong Kong, when passed, affect the entire population rather than just a narrow segment, it would cause unfairness down the line when certain interest groups have more say than others in all the issues debated at Legislative Council. Certain interest groups may, of course, give important and useful advice on specific issues, but to say that such groups must have representation at LegCo would certainly be a step that many who work within the system may be uncomfortable with. In contrast, most of the public, 57.3%, actually agreed that interest groups having significant contribution to society must have representatives in LegCo. Again, one should view with the lens of the political climate in Hong Kong. Given that most functional constituencies in the current LegCo is not representative anyway, the public may be swayed to see that it is perhaps a small step forward should LegCo have representation for those groups that actually have a contribution to society. Now, in the general elections of the Legislative Council just passed, I spent about 8 weeks on the streets of Hong Kong, meeting any Tom, Dick, or Harry that came my way. I can tell you that the government and the pro-establishment camp have been very successful in painting the Democrats into a corner by saying, oh, you have wasted a lot of public funds by filibustering. You are doing nothing. You are taking away, $92,000 a month as your salary. But mind you, those are not called salaries. The government insisted that we are not employed. That is described as an honorarium. But anyway, honorarium or salary. Well, they are complaining. The Kai Fongs are complaining to me. Well, look here, Gigor, right? You are doing nothing. You are dragging Hong Kong's feet. You are dragging us down. What is good to stand up against the Communist Party, CCP? Yeah, just one alphabet less than CCPL. Yeah, what is good? Well, you are no match for the CCP, right? Give us a break. Now, that may explain the responses that you got. Because not many in Hong Kong did have the privilege of talking to Gigor, that is me, in the streets. But whenever I was asked the question that I just relayed to you, I would ask whoever was this very aggressive approacher, well, mind you, have you understood that you have been held hostage by our chief executive? He could have reorganized the agenda so that those items of business that are not controversial, that are definitely for the good of Hong Kong, would be able to pass, instead of holding us to ransom by making you hostages. Well, you meaning the general public who would benefit from policies, livelihood policies that would benefit them, right? And I also asked them to reflect on why there was no filibustering during the reign of C.H. Tung, or for that purpose, Donald Tsang. Why filibustering has become so prevalent in the past 4 years. And I actually asked them to imagine that they were the chief executive. The most proper reaction to filibustering is to do things and to behave in such a way that make filibustering no longer necessary. Right? Think about it. Instead of trying to change the rules of procedures, trying to bring tons of brick on the Democrats. You just make us look like a fool by filibustering. You make filibustering no longer necessary. But anyway, I know that this is more legal than political an occasion, so maybe I'll stop there. But those are my observations on the three questions. As Karen kindly introduced me, I retired on the 30th of September. I am no longer a legislator, so I have more time at my disposal. So I welcome opportunities like the one presented itself today to meet more of your students, many, and members of civil society. And if my quite unique experience is helpful in making more in Hong Kong dawn to the importance of the rule of law, or the importance of democracy as a cornerstone, as a ultimate guarantee for the rule of law. Do give me a call, leave me a message on Facebook. If I can spare the time, I would certainly be more than happy to oblige. But I must, on that note, I must also apologize because I have to leave now and cannot participate in your discussions to be moderated.
Could you answer one or two questions before you?
Yeah, certainly. Because I really have to go back to the party, and today we have all the candidates coming back for an evaluation of our election strategies and all that.
Yeah, sure. We have one or two questions before.
So long as I'm not disrupting the.
For the other, we can ask later. Maybe anyone. Yeah.
Anyone wants to answer a question? Yeah, please feel free. I guess we can answer one or two questions. Anyone?
No big deal if you don't have them now. You can always. Well, I'm still around.
Thank you.
Thank you, Benny.
Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And now we have a break for about 15 minutes. Please enjoy the drink and refreshments outside, and we'll come back for more discussions. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.